And chapter 8 in your textbook is all about joints. I'm going to give some quick glossary sort of definitions that we're going to use as a key. Let me admit one more student here. So I'll call up my first whiteboard. I'm just going to write joints. This whole chapter is about that. So you and I say the word joint. Scientifically, we use the term articulation. So a joint is an articulation. That just means sort of a connection point between, a functional connection point between two bones is what we're talking about. Also, I'm going to put equals arthroses. So if you read or hear me say the word arthroses or arthrotic, basically that means the same thing as a joint. Arthro means pretty much joint. So arthritis would be, itis is inflammation of a joint. So there's some definitions. Now I'm going to do a quick classification based on degree of mobility or movement at a joint. And this we're going to refer back to quite often. So I'm writing the word classification based on degree of mobility. That means how much it moves. And there's 3 classifications. I'll just list them 1, 2, 3. They're funky words. You may not have heard them before. A synarthroses is a joint that is, I'm just going to write one word, immovable. So there's no movement at a synarthrotic joint. Second type is amphi, A-M-P-H-I, amphiarthroses. Remember, arthroses just means joint. And these are joints that are slightly movable. So if you hear me say the word, or you read the word amphiarthrotic, that means we're talking about a slightly movable joint. Now, this one in particular, this classification in particular, there's quite a wide margin of almost completely immovable to not freely movable, but there's a range of motion within the category of amphiarthrotic. And finally, number 3 is diarthrotic, D-I. So I'm going to write diarthroses. I forgot my H here. Sorry about the spelling. So diarthroses. These are fully movable joints. So we need to keep, these would be things like that you and I think of as a joint, like the elbow, the shoulder, wrist, the knee. So really quick, synarthroses, immovable, amphiarthroses, slightly movable, and diarthroses, fully movable. And we use those categorizations as adjectives, like synarthrotic would describe a joint, amphiarthrotic would describe a joint, and diarthrotic. And what we're classifying or describing is the degree of mobility at that joint. Okay, now that's the easy part. The more challenging part is classifying joints based on their structure. So I'll write out as much of this as I can. So we're gonna write structural classification. So now we're gonna classify joints based on what they're made up of, what type of tissue largely. And then while we are doing that, we're going to say if that particular joint is synarthrotic, amphiarthrotic, or diarthrotic based on its degree of mobility. So in my opinion, the biggest challenge with this whole joints chapter is this classification business. So what I recommend doing really quick before I go any further is read the book, watch this video as many times as you need to, but also try to create some sort of an outline based on classifications. I'm doing that right now for you, but it wouldn't hurt for you to just copy this over on a sheet of paper. It would really help you when it comes to quiz day. All right, so this is based on basically the type of tissue, and we'll just label these big number 1, big number 2, and big number 3, and then they get more complicated within those. So I'm going to write a 1 and circle it and write fibrous joints. That's the first major classification based on structure. These have no cavity, and that will become apparent. There's no cavity, it's just packed with tissue, and it's dense, irregular connective tissue. I'm just going to write CT to save space. That's what they're made up of. Now there's subcategories within that large number 1. So I'm going to list those as A, B, and your book writes C. I'll talk about that. Some books make slightly different classifications. I'm going to try to use the ones in your book, but I'm going to talk about it. So first type we call sutures. We learned briefly what a suture was, particularly when we were talking about the skull in the last unit. Sutures are only bones found in the skull, first of all. In adults, sutures are considered synarthrotic. That means immovable. So once sutures fully fuse, sometime after birth, they are considered immovable joints. But I'm going to just write this in children. They're not fully fused yet, and we consider them amphiarthrotic, slightly movable. So this is not rocket science. The challenge, in my opinion, is organization and language. So if you can really learn the words that we started using up here, and use them and write them as much as possible, then the categorization will become easier to remember. There's something called a synostosis, which is a suture that's replaced by complete fusion of bone to bone. I don't know if your book even lists this term, but it's worth writing. Synostosis is basically a suture that gets completely replaced by total fusion of the bone. By total fusion. Sorry, that's supposed to be total. So classic examples of these are knots in the skull because they're no longer sutures. We get total fusion of the bone. Where we find these are things like the frontal bone in the forehead. That one would be in the skull, but the pelvic bones, the ilium, ischium, and pubic bone are called synostoses because they fully fuse and become one actual bone. Technically, sutures in the skull, you can see the seams. They remain a tight fibrous joint, immovable, even in adults. All right, let's move on. So that's the first type of fibrous joint is a suture. I'm going to go to my next whiteboard and write lowercase b. So we're still talking about fibrous joints. The second one is syndesmoses. It's just a funky word. It's not hard to understand what it is. It's just remembering what that word means. This is, just to remind you, it's a fibrous joint. Because we left the last page, I'm just going to write this. So we're still under the fibrous joint major classification. We have a slight increase in distance between the bones in a syndesmosis than we did back in a suture. There's more fibrous connective tissue as ligaments. So I'm just going to write more fibrous CT in parentheses ligaments. So that's a comparison to sutures. A suture, the fibrous connective tissue is so short, it doesn't even look like a joint. It looks like this, almost like two bones glued together. In syndesmoses, we might have a bone, an actual end of a bone like this, and we see this short little fibrous thing before it connects to another bone. So there's more distance, more fibrous connective tissue that we call ligaments in there. Examples of this, just going to give you a few examples, would be the distal tibio-fibular joint. So remember, in the lower leg, the tibia is the large bone, the shin bone, and then just lateral to that is the fibula. Let me draw that really quickly. Here's the tibia. And then the fibula does this. The space, the distal tibiofibular joint right here, and technically the proximal one up here, are considered syndesmoses. Now, there are other places in the body where this occurs. That's just one example. Between the radius and ulna and the forearm, those are typical syndesmoses joints as well. In your book, this is where the categorization differs from author to author or resource to resource. In your book, the interosseous membrane is also considered one of these syndesmoses joints. The interosseous membrane is the sheet. It's a flat ligament fibrous connective tissue sheet that occurs along here between the diaphyses of those two bones, or for the example in the radius and ulna. So I'm going to write examples, tibia, fibula, or radius, ulna. Your book classifies interosseous membranes as a type of syndesmoses fibrous joint. Other books categorize an interosseous membrane in a category all by itself. I'm going to write underline sheet. Now, what your book does is it classifies gomphoses as a separate classification of fibrous joint. How I learned it when I was a student, gomphoses were just a type of syndesmoses. Nevertheless, I'm going to stick to what your book does. Gomphoses, this is a peg in socket joint. Just think the teeth. In their sockets, in the bone. So that's the classic example of gomphoses. Just to go back and remind you, these syndesmoses are amphiarthrotic. That means they're slightly movable, just to remind you. Okay. Even our gomphoses are also, well, they're technically synarthrotic, so it depends, again, it depends on what source you read, but let's just call them synarthrotic, immovable. So we're using those functional or degree of mobility classifications in addition to their structural classifications, okay? So I'm just going to go back for a second. We've done fibrous joints, large number 1, and included in fibrous joints were sutures, syndesmoses, and gomphoses. Now I'm going to go to a large number 2. The large number 1 was fibrous joints, and everything below it was considered a fibrous joint. Large number 2 are cartilaginous joints. And they get, oops, I always get ahead of myself, cartilaginous joints. They get their name because it's not dense, fibrous, irregular connective tissue joining the 2 bones. It's actually cartilage. So there's no cavity in these as well, but rather than dense, irregular, fibrous CT binding the 2 joints, cartilage is the material. I'm just going to write cartilage between bones. And we'll classify these. And they just have, rather than 3 categorizations like the fibrous joints, there's just 2 in cartilaginous joints. They do have funky names, but I'll explain. So I'm going to do 2 subcategories of cartilaginous joints. I'm just skipping to a new whiteboard. I'll write letter A, synchondroses. SYNCONDRO. Forgot my H, getting ahead of myself again. Doesn't do you any good if I don't spell them perfectly. Synchondroses. Chondro in the middle of that word, that means cartilage. So that's an easy way to remember that's a cartilaginous joint. So this, the actual type of cartilage is hyaline cartilage. That's the material creating the joint between the 2 bones. Examples of these, classic examples would be an epiphyseal plate. You know that that's a growth plate. Children and adolescents prior to it fusing bone to bone. These are considered synarthrotic, immovable. They can be damaged, they can be whacked out of alignment, but they're not supposed to be. So they're considered synarthrotic or immovable joints. Remember that word that I wrote over here on the first page, synostoses. That's what these joints become, and that's what an epiphyseal plate becomes. After the bones fuse. So remember, synostoses means full fusion of the bones, and it's no longer considered a joint at all. So we've got synchondroses, lowercase b, a symphysis, which you've heard before. Symphysis is singular, symphyses would be plural. In this one, the binding material is fibrocartilage, not hyaline cartilage. It's sort of why we do all of that tissue business at the beginning of the semester, is to hopefully give you an idea of what this material is each time we identify it later. Basically, symphyses joints all occur along the midline of the body. Okay. Example would be the pubic symphysis, which is the anterior joint of the pelvis. So examples. Remember, it's fibrocartilage. Another example would be the manubrium. Just to remind you, after I write the word, I'll remind you what it is. The manubrium to body of sternum. So if you've been studying sternum, if you've been studying the axial skeleton, the manubrium is that top piece of the sternum, heart-shaped bone like this. Right here where I'm drawing this dark line, where it articulates with the body of the sternum, the long piece, that's a symphysis as well. Remember this manubrium articulates here with the clavicle bone at the proximal sternal end right here. And that's the collarbone, the clavicle. These are considered amphiarthrotic. Symphyses are considered amphiarthrotic, which, to remind you, means slightly movable. Remember, we said last time the pubic symphysis at the front of the anterior front of the pelvis, that actually becomes very much more pliable during child labor, during childbirth. Hormonal signals that are sent to that tissue make it become more pliable so that the female pelvis can expand slightly during childbirth. Okay, where are we? I'm going to go back. I know this. If I had one giant board, it would be easier for us to categorize this. We've done fibrous joints. We're still in structural classification. We've done fibrous joints. We have done cartilaginous joints. So there's 3 types of fibrous joints, 2 types of cartilaginous joints, A and B. Now I'm going to go on to the third and final structural type of joints, which is synovial joints. So I'm going to start a new page for that and write a big number 3, circle it. Synovial joints, they do have a cavity. It's a fluid-filled cavity. Okay, that's how they're classified. We're going to talk more about synovial joints this whole week, more than any other type of joints. So the presence of a fluid-filled cavity is literally what defines something as being a joint, as being a synovial joint. Right off the bat, I'm going to say this: all synovial joints are diarthrotic. All are fully movable. Some books say freely movable. Articular cartilage is present at the surface of the bones. Not so in the previous. It's hard to talk and spell at the same time. So articular cartilage is present, I'm just going to say, on the ends of the bones at the joint. That's not necessarily the case in the other classifications we've done. So I'm going to draw a picture of a synovial joint and talk about its constituents, its structural entity, if you will. There is a joint capsule that's created in these joints that encloses the actual synovial joint itself. fluid-filled cavity. So the joint, what we call the joint capsule, is made up of these constituents, and then I'm going to list things and then draw a picture to correspond with it. There's sort of an outer fibrous layer, in addition to an inner synovial layer. So I'm going to just write plus inner synovial layer. Now, what the constituents of the outer fibrous layer, this is mostly collagen fibers. So I'm going to write the word collagen. Remember, that's a type of fiber that's very strong because it has the protein collagen in it. It attaches, the outer fibrous layer attaches to the bones, directly to the bones, diaphyses. That means the shaft of the bones, almost like an extension of that periosteum. Like periosteum extensions. It helps the joint structurally. So it gives a lot of strong structure to that joint. It prevents dislocation. What we're going to find as I'm writing this is that the most movable joints in the human body, the advantage is, of course, that they bring movement and mobility. The disadvantage is they're weaker. They're not nearly as structurally strong as the previous fibrous joints. And finally, the outer fibrous layer forms ligaments. All right, now I'm going to talk about the inner synovial layer a little bit. It's mostly made up of areolar connective tissue, in addition to elastic fibers, not collagen fibers, and some adipose tissue as well, fat pads. That adipose tissue is to help with articulation. All right, now I'm going to draw a basic synovial joint for you on the next page, and we'll talk a little bit more about the structure of it and its function as well. So let's just do this. I'm going to draw a bone, just a generic bone. That's not any specific bone in the body. This is for simplicity's sake. We're going to exaggerate the distance between these two bones. In real joints, that space between there is not nearly that great. It's very narrow. So the first thing I'm going to do is put articular cartilage on the surface right here of these two bones. So the blue stuff that I'm drawing now is hyaline cartilage, and it acts as articular cartilage, a smooth surface. Next, I'm going to draw the joint cavity, which is basically defined by the synovial membrane. I'm looking in your book, they use green to do that, or sort of a greenish color to create this enclosure here. This green tissue is a synovial membrane. The blue stuff was hyaline cartilage that's acting as articular cartilage. All articular cartilage at joints is hyaline cartilage tissue. And technically that synovial membrane is double walled, so I'll exaggerate it like this. It's a bilayered membrane. Inside of this cavity, in this area, there's synovial fluid. So it's a fluid-filled cavity. Like I said, this is a great exaggeration of that space. Then there's a fibrous layer on the outside of the synovial membrane. So I'm going to use black to define this fibrous layer here. It encloses the cavity. That's not the most superficial layer of fibrous tissue. Then there's another layer out here of really serious, dense, regular fibrous connective tissue that acts as a ligament. That's the basis of a synovial joint. I'm going to talk a little bit about the fluid now that's found inside of that capsule. So this is synovial fluid. I'm going to list some constituents of it. It's secreted by those green membranes, the synovial membrane itself. So where does synovial fluid come from? I'm just going to write secreted by synovial membrane cells and fluid from our bloodstream, from blood plasma. It's really from capillaries in that area. So that's where the fluid originates. And it's a viscous fluid, kind of the consistency of egg whites, kind of looks like egg white. The constituents, one of the main constituents in synovial fluid is hyaluronic acid. So this constituent is found in synovial fluid, and it comes from the membrane cells of the synovial, of that synovial membrane, as well as from blood plasma. What is the function of this stuff? It reduces friction, decreases friction is its main function. It also lubricates and acts as a shock absorber. And finally, it does to some degree bring nutrition to the cartilage cells, the chondrocytes in this articular cartilage. I'm just exaggerating my articular cartilage here. So there's living cells in cartilage in little pockets, almost like bone cells, but they're cartilage cells called chondrocytes. They need to get nutrition, and that synovial fluid does bring them some nutrition as well. Finally, in synovial fluid, we also find the presence of phagocytic cells. Just think immune cells. They sort of patrol that area to keep infection at bay, to keep infection out of that joint. Few fun facts about this. When we immobilize a synovial joint, when it's left immobile for long periods of time, this fluid inside of here tends to get more viscous. It increases the viscosity of the fluid, and it makes that joint a little bit stiffer and harder to move. When we crack our joints, it's theorized that there are actually gas bubbles in the joint, in that synovial fluid, that pop when we crack our joints. Typically that synovial joint, say for your fingers, for example, in your knuckles, that joint's been held immobile for hours and hours. And when we crack our knuckles, we hear that popping sound. It's theorized that that's gas bubbles in the fluid, and that's become more viscous, that causes that popping sound. All right, so let me go to a new page and just talk about extra capsular ligaments. Back in our picture, those were the ligaments on the furthest on the outside of the joint itself. We call those ligaments extracapsular ligaments because they're technically on the outside of the synovial capsule itself. Those would act examples like collateral ligaments of the knee joint. You've heard of those cruciate ligaments, the ACLs and MCLs, those anterior cruciate ligaments and medial cruciate ligaments. Those are extracapsular ligaments. Intracapsular ligaments are found closer to the knee joint themselves. Articular discs. We've heard of discs, intervertebral discs. Articular discs are also called menisci. You've probably heard of a knee meniscus, so I'm going to explain what that is. Meniscus is singular, menisci is plural. So let's just do an example of an articular disc or a meniscus. Example in the knee. There are other places we find menisci, but the classic example is the knee joint. Really quickly, in a knee joint, the femoral condyles that come down the distal part of the femur and the tibial joint, the proximal end of the tibial joint. So these are the femoral condyles that I've drawn here, up here, and these are the tibial condyles where they meet. There's a pad of fibrocartilage in here called the knee meniscus. And it's that's what it looks like from a frontal view. It's actually fibrocartilage. It's not hyaline cartilage. From a bird's eye view, it kind of looks like this. And there's a twist to it. It has two pieces. Kind of almost looks like a figure 8 without holes in it. And the condyles of the femur sit here and here. So we say that there's a lateral medial meniscus. Technically, it's all connected tissue. Its main function is shock absorption. So just remember that menisci are made of fibrocartilage and their function is shock absorption. It also increases the fit. So increases to make it a tighter fit and helps with the movements, the combined movements of a sophisticated joint like the knee. Helps distribute the weight and the synovial fluid. I'm just going to write distributes weight and fluid. So we've defined what an articular disc or meniscus is. Next, I'm going to define a labrum. L-A-B-R-U-M, it's pronounced labrum. This is extended fibrocartilage. It's kind of a lip. It extends past the joint. I'm just right past joint. Classic example where we find these are ball and socket joints of the shoulder and the hip. So we have labrums in our ball and socket joint of the femur to the ilium, that acetabulum, as well as in the head of the humerus to that glenoid cavity of the scapula. Last bit about some basics about synovial joints. Synovial cavities are highly innervated. That means there's lots of nerve endings. There are basically no direct vessels in the cavity. So I'm writing no vascularization inside the cavity. There's rich vascularization right around the edge. And so fluid gets pushed out of the blood into that cavity space, but there's no direct blood supply itself. There are many outside, but not inside. I'm going to define what a bursa is. You've probably heard of bursitis. That's plural if I put the E at the end. If I drop the E, it's singular. So a bursa or bursae would be how you pronounce plural, is a fluid-filled sac that's associated with a synovial joint. I'm going to write around. They're closely associated with synovial joints. These bursae, what they do is they help decrease the friction around a joint. These are very sophisticated joints, and there's lots of different moving parts. And so these bursae, they're just fluid-filled sacs that basically sit between muscle tendons and hard bone, and they keep the tendons from grinding over bone surfaces. They're like a pad, a fluid-filled pad that helps reduce the friction. They're filled with similar fluid to synovial fluid. I'm just going to write similar to synovial fluid. You might not have heard this one before. A tendon sheath is basically the same thing as a bursa, only it wraps around a tendon, sort of like a bun around a hot dog. So it's not just, a bursa would be a fluid-filled sac like this, in which a tendon might ride over the top. It acts as a pad between a muscle tendon and a hard bone surface, if this is bone down here. So that's a bursa. A tendon sheath tends to be wrapped, almost a tubular shape. Let me get a different color. I'll be consistent here. A tendon sheath might look something like this. And it actually wraps around a muscle tendon like this. And it has some distance to it as well, some volume to it. So it's almost like a hot dog bun enclosing the hot dog, wrapping around it. I'm just going to write a tube like bursa around a long muscular tendon. All right, before we leave today, I'm going to go through joint movements. I'm going to come back to synovial joints and specific joints at my next lecture, but I did want to talk about angular movements at synovial joints in this talk. So we're almost finished. I do want you to review these, I'm going to go through each one by one and give you an example and talk about them more than I'm going to write. They're all pictured in chapter 8 in your textbook. I have an older version of the textbook. Mine starts on 258 and runs through 261. Basically, they're photographs of a human doing these movements that I'm just going to list and then describe to you, okay? So angular movements at synovial joints. I do expect you to know the name of the angular movement and somewhat its description. So let's just do that before we leave. And I'll go in the order of your book. The term gliding. This refers to when two flat surfaces of bones move back and forth in a gliding motion across each other. And the classic examples of gliding movements are in the carpals and tarsals. That's our wrist and ankle bones. I want you to know what gliding means and some examples of where that type of movement occurs. If you move your hand back and forth, hold the palm of your hand upward and face it, and then move your whole hand right and left, you're getting gliding movement between your carpal bones and your wrist. Next to our flexion, I'm going to do both of them together, and extension, because these two movements oppose one another. I'll define flexion and extension for you and then give you examples. The definition of flexion really is when we flex, we decrease the angle at a joint, and this almost always occurs at a hinge joint. So if you stick your arm out, your right arm out, and perfectly straight, and then you bend at the elbow, you flex your elbow, you're making the angle of your elbow of that joint go from, so if this is an extended arm, here's the elbow, there's your forearm. Let's just make a fist here. There's a fist. If we flex this way, this is 180 degrees when your arm is straight at the elbow. But when we flex, we decrease that angle to say 90 degrees. And then if we keep flexing more to 45 degrees. So we're decreasing the angle from 180 at a joint. Extension is the opposite. It's just increasing the angle, going in the opposite direction at typically a hinge joint. So classic examples, they're all over the body. We can get flexion, extension. Your book uses the head, that's at the neck. So if you bend your head forward, you're flexing. If you hold your head straight up, that's extension. If you tip your head further back beyond extension, that's called hyperextension. I'm going to say the elbow, the knee. We can also flex and extend at the hip joints. If you're standing up straight, that's considered extension. If you bend over and bending only at the hips, that's considered flexion at the hips. Okay, we've done enough of that one. Let's go to abduction and adduction. I'll give you the definitions and then examples. These occur in pairs as well because the movements are opposite or oppose each other. Abduction, the definition is to move typically a body part away from the midline of the body. So if you stand up straight with your arms at your side and then raise both of your arms, the movement occurs at your shoulders. But if you raise both of your arms, you're moving your arms away from the midline of the body. You are abducting your arms. Adduction is moving toward the midline. So now if you lower your arms back to your sides, you are adducting your arms because they are moving toward the midline. This can occur with your arms at the shoulder joint. It can occur all over the body. It can occur with your legs at the hip joint. But the classic examples are arms and legs. abduction and adduction. Circumduction is sort of a special movement on its own. Circumduction refers to, I'm going to do it with rotation because they're different movements. They're similar but different. When we circumduct, this occurs at ball and socket joints, like the shoulder and hips. And what we do is we scribe a cone in space. I know you're probably thinking, what does that mean? Hold your right arm straight out and so that it's perfectly straight. And then if you rotate at your shoulder, making your hand, your distal hand, create a circle in space, like you're doing warm-up circles with your arms to heat up your shoulders, that's circumduction. We can do it at ball and socket joints. Rotation is actually turning on a singular axis. Now I'm going to cut my whiteboard here to give you an example of what both of these movements are. You can also look in your book if you want. So rotation, we can rotate our heads. If I just turn my head, nodding it no, back and forth, that's a rotation because the singular axis is my cervical vertebrae, like this. That's not moving in space. We're rotating the head around that axis. Likewise, if I stick my arm out here for you right here, here I'm rotating my arm if I turn it like this. Circumduction is different. Circumduction is taking and moving our arm like this. We're scribing a cone in space. So circumduction is this. Rotation is moving like this, keeping the axis in one plane. All right, we're almost finished with this. So let's go on to, we've done circumduction, rotation, supination, and pronation. There's supposed to be an I there. Supination, do both together. Supination basically means turning the palms upward. Pronation is turning the palms downward. So if you hold your arms straight out in front of you, really what this is a movement of the radius and ulna. When we supinate, turning the palms upward toward the sky, our radius and ulna are parallel to each other. When we pronate and turn the palms downward toward the ground, the radius and ulna then tend to cross over each other and make an X form. Next on the list is dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. These are movements at the ankle with the foot. So both of these are at the foot. When we dorsiflex, we basically turn our toes upward. If you're seated and you stick your legs straight out and you point your toes, not pointing your toes like a ballerina, but turning your toes, pulling your toes upward. That's dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion is the opposite. That's pointing the toes down. So when you're in a standing position, if you stand on your toes, that's plantar flexion, or pointing your toe like a ballet dancer. Dorsiflexion is opposite movement, pulling your toes upward. Inversion and eversion, also done with the foot, special movement of the foot. This one's hard to do, but if you're in a standing position Inversion is just turning the sole of your foot inward toward the midline of the body. There's pictures in your book. If we were in person, I would give you examples myself, but since we are not, I wrote eversion is turning the sole outward laterally in an opposite direction. Protraction, retraction. Protraction means jutting something forward. Retraction means pulling it back. Classic examples of this, if you jut your lower jaw, your mandible out forward, creating like an underbite type of picture, that's protracting. Retraction is just pulling it back. So this is forward, moving something forward, and this is pulling it back toward the body. Elevation and depression. Almost finished. Almost to the end of the list. This is pretty straightforward. Elevation means moving upward in a superior direction. Depression means moving downward. So classic example of this is the scapula. When you shrug your shoulders, when you raise your shoulders, what you're doing is the scapula is being elevated. When you drop your shoulders back down to a normal resting position, it's going in a depression direction and your scapula is moving back downward. So elevation just means moving something up. Likewise, when you close your mandible, that's elevating it. And when you open your mouth, that's depressing the mandible. Finally, last one is opposition. That's by itself. That's a very special movement that only primates have, and that's the ability to move your thumb across the palm of your hand. So if you take your thumb right now, the tip of your thumb, and you touch it to the tip of your pinky, you are opposing your thumb. You're moving it across the palm of your hand. All right, I am going to cut my recording here.